So with the heat in
Circularity.
mind, let's get started. There's
Indeed,
a lot to
let's.
get through. And indeed, circularity. I mean, before we begin properly, should we do some quick introductions? So I am Rosanna Falconer, and I'm co-founder of FashMash and a brand consultant.
Yeah, great. And I am Rachel Arthur, and I am the other co-founder of FashMash and largely a sustainability consultant.
Perfect. So I suppose the key thing to say before we begin today is the core business mission of Fash to us now, as it was 8 years ago. It is to encourage open conversation and sharing of ideas to help drive the industry forward. And we see these lives as a very, very big part of that.
You know, we know that sustainability at large is a really big focus for our members. The circularity within that indeed is as well, whether it's, you know, people that work in brand and are starting to experiment with different options in this space, and indeed lots of startups that are really owning this world as well, which is incredibly exciting. So that's what we're exploring here today, focused specifically on the ability to scale circularity. Can we actually make it a reality truly in the industry at large? And what do we need for that future to be a reality?
Before we begin, I would like to share very proudly that we are sponsored by Clavio. Clavio is an e-commerce marketing platform. And the key reason I think it is so important to our viewers today, I know a lot of you work in this space and it is focused on growth. It works with brands of all sizes, all kinds, from Skinny Dip London to high studios. And what they offer is precise targeting, but equally precision. Well, no, I'm getting it the wrong way around. Oh, it's 7 p.m. It's precision targeting and precise insights. So really invaluable for lots of you, I'm sure. If you would like to check them out, go to clavio.com/FashMash. That is KLAVIYO.com/FashMash. And you can start your free trial today. As we always begin, Rachel, what inspired you this week?
Yes, well, so I've been trying to do a lot more getting out and about and walking, although I suppose that's actually been through lockdown full stop, but I've really got into a lot in the way of podcasts. I think I keep mentioning podcasts on these inspiration things because that's what I've been consuming the most, I suppose, during all of this. And my latest one that I'm obsessed with is called So Hot Right Now. And it's from journalist Lucy Siegel and filmmaker Tom Mustill. It is a must. It is all about the communication side of nature and the climate crisis, which I think is really interesting. They say to save the world, we need to change the story, which is a fascinating thing because we talk all the time. I mean, you and I do a lot around consumer awareness and how can we actually encourage more in the way of education and everything else. And I think that communications part is such an important piece of this whole sustainability discussion. So just a reminder really of how critical storytelling is, which is exactly what this podcast is about. So every single episode is exploring the storytellers that do it really well. And they start with a massive one. They start with David Attenborough. So it literally doesn't get any better. Yeah. And it is the most incredible episode. It's recorded at the beginning of lockdown. It's literally done over the phone. Apparently they found this really old school technology to be able to like make it all work because he has a landline. So just fantastic. And it's all about his like skill of storytelling, obviously. And one of the bits I found that really resonated with me was around that moment when we all started paying attention to single-use plastics. And obviously that came with him on the beach holding up all the plastic waste that was there. And he's asked how can we recreate that moment? Like what was it about that? And he kind of basically said that if he had that skill, that knowledge, obviously it'd be worth its weight in gold. And actually what it was a perfect storm. Like who knows, maybe it was the channel it was on, maybe it was the time of day, maybe it was something else people have been watching, maybe it was just like the right moment in the sort of consumer, in the zeitgeist kind of thing. And I think that's probably what it was. So it's brilliant. And then the other one I'd recommend, there's several of them now, I think there's 5 or 6 so far, it's brand new. The second one is Ellie Goulding, and she's a UN ambassador, and she talks about the role of celebrity in all this and how important celebrity is. And interesting, it's just as a reminder of the scope of awareness that's out there and also how much apathy there is around climate change. She says, and we've talked about this before, that whenever she posts anything to do with the environment and sustainability, she loses followers, like about 1,000 followers or something each time. So that I found really interesting as well. So highly recommend. and any of those episodes, just really interesting and just a slightly different perspective on what we're talking about to do with
Really,
climate change.
yeah, and that was something that Arizona Muse mentioned.
Yes,
Not
she
losing
did.
followers, but she said her engagement just wasn't there. She mentioned that in
Yeah. I
our
think she did say
FashMash
she lost
Pioneers
followers.
talk. Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And
So
talking of interactions, hello to Georgie McIntyre and
yes.
Ollie. I've seen them both tuning in, and they are regulars in our Pioneer series and members. So hello to you both. My inspiration.
Yes, what's yours?
I've been thinking about a lot about the future talent, the next generation. I think it's partly because I'm hanging out on TikTok far too much. I find it a very happy, creative, fulfilling place. It is my new obsession. And then also because I have been thinking a lot on a new project that we are launching next week. Everybody watch this space Monday. Rachel and I are so excited. So the next generation, really for me, that is just, it's quite a broad inspiration for the week, but that is it. And I just wanted to share one anecdote in particular. Greta Thunberg has won a €1 million prize. To be specific, it was the Gulbenkian Prize for Humanity. And she has actually decided to give all of that prize to charitable projects that are combating climate change. And I think that just speaks volumes about the next gen. And we're actually going to be talking more about them in this conversation this evening. So stay tuned. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we said at the beginning, circularity as a sort of pocket within sustainability has been something we've been talking about for quite a long time in lots of different capacities. And what we wanted to do with our conversation with some of our members was start to explore, what does that look like in reality for the industry? Where are we at with it, and how can we start to get it to a place where it is much more of the norm, I suppose, not just an experiment, but something that we are constantly talking about. And it was also around how can we use everything that's happened during the pandemic, the past 4 months, 4 or 5 months now, to think more about circular business models and how can that really impact us all as well. When we discussed sustainability on our last IG Live, one of the things we really talked about is the fact that we're in this moment of survival as an industry above all else, and it's kind of a crucial sort of focus within the economy more broadly too, which puts sustainability in a really, really tough space. And a lot of our members, when we were talking about it, really have been pointing out that anything that isn't core isn't being prioritized currently. So for some businesses, that does mean sustainability is still there. For others that are still just experimenting or early in this conversation, they've had to push it further down the list, which is incredibly tough, obviously, for those of us within the space that are really trying to push it forward. And this is part of the risk, I think, with circularity right now as well, especially when we're talking about it being applied to existing businesses and brands, of course, from that sort of new business model side of things. So things like rental and resale, which obviously we'll talk more about today as well. And just the fact that is that it has been an experiment, and therefore is it priority for them within all of this, which I know, Rosanna, you're going to talk a little bit more about shortly. However, to turn it to a sort of optimistic viewpoint, which is obviously what we normally like to do, the pandemic, you would have thought that rolled off the tongue now, we say it so often. The pandemic has done one thing that I think has really helped us towards this agenda, and that is the simple fact that it's really exposed the need to rethink inventory management. We've known for a really long time that inventory is one of the sort of biggest challenges in industry, just managing that full stop and the sort of sheer volume of it moving around the world. But what we obviously have seen during all of this is just billions of pounds worth of stock stuck in, sort of standstill, whether it was in the manufacturers, it was in warehouses, distribution centres, indeed in the stores themselves. Obviously throughout lockdown, and that's beginning to loosen a little bit more now. But what it showed us was just how much product we have full stop tied up at any one time. And I think, and indeed to consumers as well, that's been quite mind-blowing to actually stop and think about just how much is out there. And importantly, as a result, the amount of waste that there is as well. We've all, again, known that for a long time, but this has just made it more and more evident. Separate to this discussion is, of course, what we're doing with that waste that's been created during the pandemic right now. But the bigger conversation is in the notion of us recognizing the vulnerabilities that lie in the current system and the detriment that comes to both people and planet as a result of the ridiculous amount of waste that we produce constantly, obviously, whether it's season by season in terms of collections, or indeed week by week when we're talking about fast fashion. you know, we've got to remember that we're in an industry right now that is systemically broken. We talk about this idea quite a lot. It is fundamentally cheaper to overproduce. So we are doing that as standard, which is obviously not okay. And by the way, we produce about 100 billion items of clothing a year, which is completely nuts. So that presents us with an opportunity, I think, frankly, to now be thinking really quite differently about what our assets are as a business and where we hold value, recognizing, I think, quite importantly, that a circular business model could actually be one that is ultimately more resilient than a linear one. And that's kind of can be then a core part of our conversation when we're talking about strategy currently. So that's what gives me a lot of hope, is kind of all of the potential in this when we sort of stop and recognize the issues that are in hand, but also the resilience that could come if we shift in a slightly different way. The other side of this whole conversation was then represented by many of the circular businesses by their very conception were in our conversation. So those that come from the rental, resale and restoration space. And one of the things, again, to give us some hope is that the biggest sentiment here is that business was actually going quite well during lockdown. And if it was, you know, stable, then it is certainly doing better and picking up again now. And that actually what they've seen happen is basically an enormous amount of opportunity be presented off the back of the whole pandemic, and this renewed sense of conscious consumerism, which again we're going to talk to a little bit more. So again, you know, just to round it up in a very optimistic sense, I think that's all quite exciting, and that sort of shows why we really wanted to talk about this subject, because I think there's so much potential within it to take it from where it's been and hopefully catapult it forward. So yeah.
I mean, in terms of catapulting it forward, it is worth saying straight away that those businesses that Rachel mentioned in the rental space and in the restoration space, these are the new guard of business. They are startups, and I think the conundrum we have here is it has to be fully integrated into businesses, into their core business model. And at the moment, what we're finding, rather than it being integrated across brands, it's really just reliant, the circularity of fashion is really just reliant on startups and on pilot schemes. It's 2 years since the launch of the Ellen MacArthur campaign to make fashion circular. And quite honestly, I've seen very little change in that time. Back then, they predicted that if nothing changes, by 2050, the fashion industry will use up to a quarter of the world's carbon budget. I mean, personally, due to the change, or rather lack thereof, we've seen in the last 2 years, I imagine that figure is generous. How do we take this next step that is so vital and urgent? The general consensus on our FashMash focus call was that the barrier to these R's, if I group them, from recycling to restoration, from rental to resale, it is the 3 I's. The I's being infrastructure, investment, and integration. I'm sure we've all seen brands working on circularity across at different levels. So on the rental space, we've got Urban Outfitters, Anthropologie, H&M. They have done small rental initiatives with a mixed response, more of which later. To a large extent, the Outnet, which has been around for 2 years, now that, I mean, 2 years, 2 decades, over 2 decades, that has provided, and Ollie, thank you for your comment, Rach and I will look at that. To a large extent, that has really been it's a long established resale model for luxury brands. And then as for restoration, I just always reference those who are lucky enough to own a Chanel product, the lifetime guarantee of exquisite restoration that they offer. And also they always say, you don't need to bring a receipt, we recognize our own product, we recognize the quality. That is so integrated into the brand that that's the kind of integration one would need to see across the board for this to work. Pilots are run by marketing teams, not operations teams. At best, there's no real longevity with them beyond the initial PR spin, and at worst, the consumer sees with them and thinks that they are inauthentic. In reality, I think it will take a complete reinvention of the current system to get to the scale that is required, and that means that buy-in from the C-suite is absolutely key, from the C-suite and the board. There has to be a business case and there has to be a revenue opportunity. it's a question of the disruptors versus the dinosaurs. And I feel the startups we mentioned earlier that we had on our call, those are the disruptors. But equally, we had more traditional businesses on the call, and the feedback was, it's like moving the Titanic from the iceberg. Is that, I always get my metaphors wrong, but I think that you get what I mean. It's hard to move these huge and very well established businesses.
Indeed.
That's the one. The former will pressurize the latter to wake up. So I have no doubt that these disruptors will pressurize and will cause change. Indeed, Depop's recent 90% upswing, and then the make do and mend attitude that a lot of consumers have taken to over lockdown, and finally the UK's new rental market that really came to such prominence last year. All of this proves that the customer is waking up to the concept, but it's not fast enough. And I think what this comes down to, the biggest hope lies in the new players shaping the competitive landscape and encouraging others on that journey. As ever, I know Rachel feels as strongly as I do that the change has to come from the brands. It cannot come from the consumer. And Rachel, I'm going to throw it back at you on that note.
Yeah. I think one of the things I wanted to pull up on there was this idea of disruptors versus dinosaurs. And for me, it's incredibly exciting to think about the potential of one of these new circular business models truly getting to scale by themselves. And I think, it's really worth thinking about this idea that, like, right now the chips are really down. Whenever we see recession, we tend to see innovation, and where things start to get really exciting with like potential basically coming off the back of it. And I think, the strongest ones really do tend to be the ones that work all against the odds and stand out. It's worth thinking about Net-a-Porter. They launched in the year 2000. They came out the other side of the dot-com bust, where no one was at all interested in putting fashion on the internet. Nasty Matinee, you have to fight backstage to be allowed in. People used to laugh at her, this notion of putting things on e-commerce. I've got the most amazing quote, which actually I pulled from a deck that I used to present to clients several years ago. This is from New York Magazine, and they said designer clothes did not belong in a marketplace known for trafficking primarily in electronics and porn. So that was the perception at that point, the internet, when Nasty Matinee obviously had the foresight to introduce us to luxury e-commerce. We obviously all know the huge success story that has come off of the back of that. So my question
Everyone's
is, like, who's
agreeing,
going to do the circularity? Exactly. So who's going to do the circularity version of that? Because there will be a version of it that gets to that kind of size. Like, there just will be. And obviously, we've seen bits of it in rental and resale already. Obviously, there are some big players there. Currently, I think we're yet to see like that mega brand take off that is, in common lexicon in terms of us all being aware of it, countrywide, not just in London, as I mentioned. Now, when we talked about barriers there, and I love the 3 I's that you mentioned, let me touch a little bit there on investment, which obviously connects very closely to infrastructure. The fact is, right now, the costs involved with this systemic changes required to truly do circularity at scale remain a barrier for adoption, and that's particularly on the brand and the business side. And then similarly on the startup side as well, the same thing here. There's huge funding needed to build the sort of infrastructure that can enable efficiencies and thus handle scale. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So we need to look at where that funding can come from. There was a really good report that came good, and the Boston Consulting Group looking at this last year. I can't actually remember what it was called, but it was around financing specifically. And I've got some of the insights here. First of all, it highlighted that we need between 20 and 30 billion US dollars per year to drive sustainable fashion. So this was sustainability at large, not just circularity. But that's the scale of opportunity and the scale of the challenge, really, that exists. And one of the things I found really interesting around this is that it broke up the conversation between soft tech, that being things that we would consider basically that are mainly on software. So platforms, the sort of new business models we're talking about, rental, resale, etc. Versus comparatively what we call hard tech, and those are ones that are more physical, asset intensive companies. So that is things like the raw materials, the recycling processing, all of that side of things, which are indeed much more intensive, and thus much more complicated and indeed harder as a result to truly scale them. So there's a higher flow of funds, according to this report, in the former, so in those new business models, the rentals and so forth of the world, which is not surprising. They're much more tangible in many ways. You know, we can all sort of understand what rental is. We can quickly prove its worth in terms of getting consumers on board immediately and so forth. Much harder with the latter, where actually you need the funds to push through the R&D to even be able to. And arguably, you know, what's interesting about this is that actually it's the latter, you know, that hard tech that we need to really transition to something that is truly circular long term. So the report explains basically how important it is to have financing both ways round, but in order to advance solutions from the R&D stage that we see most of the sort of much more complex technologies that are needed for circularity, to fully commercialized products, which is indeed the only way that we will get to a fully circular business model and indeed industry. It's also just, you know, worth saying that it's so important in this conversation on circularity that we are thinking broadly about it in all forms. So not just rental, restoration as those kind of easy ones. They're certainly not easy, don't get me wrong. There are incredible businesses doing very hard work in that space, but the easy ones to roll off the tongue when we're talking about circularity and very easily fit the other side. You know, within that, obviously recycling is an easy one to mention. We don't necessarily, I think majority of us don't actually understand what it entails to actually recycle fashion. Only 1% of clothing currently is actually recycled, so it's a very small amount, and the barrier there really is around the sort of the processing technologies themselves. They're just not at a stage where they can maintain the quality of the fibers to put it back into new fashion. You know, so what we tend to see is a lot of downcycling. You know, everything that's collected from H&M, for instance, will probably end up in carpets and you know, furniture stuffing and things like that. So yeah, particularly fascinating. But then also other words, reuse, regeneration, like what's happening in all of that space as well. There's tons of different areas, again, all beginning with R, which is very convenient. So for anyone not familiar, I really urge you to spend time with the butterfly model of circularity. I don't think that's the official phrase, but if you do Google butterfly model for circularity, it does come up, and that's because it does indeed look like a butterfly. Have a look at that one. It's available via the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That indeed is the organization that created it in the first place. So worth having a look at that. And I think, you know, what sort of wrap up this thing, I think what's really interesting when you understand those kind of models, you see the complexity of what we're talking about, and you can start to understand the need for R&D, how critical that is within it all. And Hannah's just shared that that infographic there of the butterfly model from Ellen MacArthur. But yeah, so you start to see really how critical that need for funding and investment is, and that being sort of one of the biggest barriers tied with infrastructure to get us to the scale that we're talking about. So yeah, a lot of focus there. On top of all that, we talked about a lot in our focus session was the idea then of all of this being adopted within existing businesses. What we need to go back to is regulation, that being another sort of barrier also, or certainly something that could, I suppose, be a help in many ways to get us to move us a little bit forward, is if it becomes mandatory in some capacity or another. So I think that's quite interesting. I don't think we should today. I do think maybe that needs to be a future conversation because it is so complex, but there is a lot being worked on in this space. So if you're interested in that side of things, do have a good explore of it, and I can happily chat to people about it further as well. It's an important part to acknowledge that we need that within all of this also to actually be able to, you know, truly see it adopted at scale within the industry, because I don't think the incentives are quite there otherwise. And then the final angle for the adoption of circularity, then, if we have, you know, the private sector already thinking about this space or being encouraged to think more about this space, we have indeed investment and financing, and we have government coming in. Of course, the last section that we need, that we've touched on a little bit already, is really around civil society, or indeed consumers. So over to you, Rosanna. I know you have such a view on where all of this plays together, and this crucial role of consumers in sort of helping us on this journey in many ways, even if they're not ultimately the ones most responsible for it.
Yeah, it's an area I find fascinating. And Lee, thank you for your comment. And I agree, the pressure. I'm actually going to talk about that as my very final point, because it fascinates me. particularly what's happened on with regard to the media in the last year. Also, we had a comment a little bit further up, a question saying, are there any real success stories in the rental and resale space? Well, in the US, Rent the Runway, it has been affected by the pandemic, there is no doubt, but it is considered a massive success story. That is the one that has then led to the very exciting launches in 2019 in the UK of both peer-to-peer startups and ones that work more closely with brands. I'm talking Her, by Rotation, and My Wardrobe HQ. So there's been a massive upswing, certainly, and that was just naming a very small few in the UK. And then of course resale, we've got Depop, we've got the Real. I mean, the options
Vestiaire,
are
Vestiaire,
so the option, Rebel. I mean, where do we begin? So and as someone, and I know Rachel does as well, both of us love scouring and scouting those sites. So if you ever want any
and
tips
the charity
on
shops,
either, and the charity shops, rental, resale, we are your girls. But that's another live, back onto
Can I add one thing?
attitudes. Oh yes,
it does. One thing, just a tiny thing to just say, and then and this is sort of thinking about those startups, just because you mentioned Rent the Runway. I think one of my concerns around circularity, and this is just a little flag, you know, and to be fair to Rent the Runway, they didn't start out to really be a sustainable circular business model. I think that was probably a happy accident in many ways, that actually this became a key topic of conversation off the bat. My understanding of, and you know, not to pick on them particularly, but is the risk of something like this is that you end up becoming another version of the linear traditional model packaged as a circular one. And the trouble with and this is the trouble with getting to scale, that actually to really make the numbers work, whilst you might be renting out items, there's a desire for newness that comes from the consumer. So what ends up happening is that you keep putting more and more new product through there to keep encouraging the consumer there, and then you've got all of this excess stock that you have to do something with. And I believe, I may not have this exactly right, but I believe Rent the Runway is now the second largest buyer of new clothing in the US, which is absolutely mind-blowing.
The biggest dry cleaner in the US, isn't that right?
Indeed. So lots of ramifications, which again, we could have another conversation about the unintended consequences that come off the back of our sustainability actions, but that's probably another massive topic. But anyway, sorry, Rosanna.
On to the consumer. Look, as I mentioned earlier, there have been rays of hope across consumer attitudes when it comes to the circular market, from rental to repair. But for every positive anecdote, there is the contrast of the queues outside Primark that we mentioned in our last live. Do check it out on IGTV. Something that Rachel and I are aware of, for example, is that we exist in echo chambers, our own little communities, and we need to be aware of what's going on outside them. For example,
our eco-echo chamber.
Our eco-echo chamber, precisely. Now, I feel that for me, the change in the fashion industry's view of vintage, thank you very much, Nikki, was when Renee Zellweger wore a Jean Dessay 1959 yellow gown to the Oscars in 2001. I feel like the press and therefore the consumer really perked up to the concept of vintage at that point. And talking of yellow, who can forget Kate Moss's yellow cocktail dress? That was a moment for me. But on the other side, I was hugely impacted by Aja Barber's first article for EcoAge that she wrote last year. She is the most phenomenal activist. You must check out both her Instagram and the writing that she does for EcoAge. And last year, she described how she was teased at school for her thrifted outfits that she loved. She said that the taunts included, "You mean you wear other people's clothes? Gross." So
we can all kind of remember that version, right, where it was like non-school uniform day and there was so much pressure to wear something new and trendy, and you know, I presume that still exists today.
And the cruelty of children,
if not much more so.
Yeah, definitely. So there has been a mass shift away from this idea of ownership in other sectors. Take Netflix, take Zipcar. What is stopping that mindset switch in fashion? How can that same concept be applied? So I feel we need to split this conversation into pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Last year, for example, the future of rental was really very bright. It was projected to be worth 2 billion by 2023. It was taking off in the UK, as I mentioned just now, with all those new startups. And the hurdles for the consumer really were only convenience. So it was just a question of geography. At present, those businesses hadn't really expanded beyond the big cities, and it was the scale that was making the models hard to progress. Now, post-pandemic, so I feel like the first one we need to confront is one of hygiene. On a very simple scale, charity shops at the moment are not even accepting clothing. Believe me, I have tried, and that is for reasons of hygiene. So I feel that should be a fairly straightforward barrier to overcome. I rent my daughter's wardrobe very proudly from Bundley. The founder, Eve, was on one of our FashMash focus sessions. And for me, when I'm questioned about the hygiene of that, I actually cite some facts that I love. It's far more hygienic and clean, those bundles of beautifully laundered clothes that I receive in the post, than the clothes that one can buy in the shop for a child. So each new bundle is professionally cleaned, it's quality checked, and then it's sanitized in an eco-friendly ozone chamber to kill bacteria. So take that, people who say it's not hygienic.
Indeed.
But then then there's that matter of consumer choice. So yes, they are faced with but then that is contrasted with this summer's crazy sale discounts. Consumer behavior is volatile. We are fickle, and consumer finances right now are completely uncertain with the economy in rapid decline. At a time of recession, circular options can make a lot of sense financially. You can think about investment buying and buying better, but to play devil's advocate, when you need a little lift, there's that cheap, shiny item in the high street store that you're passing. It's very tempting. The guests on our Focus conference call emphasised the positives they have found in their businesses. Stuck at home, there has been this mass change in the consumer conscience, both with wardrobe clear-outs, and then this idea that actually quite a minimalist living, and the idea of living with your essentials, and that's all you need. For me, it comes down again to the eyes. So this is a question of incentivization and influence. That's why.
Like, you're all about the eyes tonight. I love it.
I'm all about the eyes and the R's. Oh my gosh.
The eyes and the R's.
It's my name, Rosanna, and my daughter's name, India. Meanwhile,
there it is.
Back to incentivization and influence. So I really want to end back where we began. We began with our inspirations, and mine was looking at the new generation and Gen Z. I keep saying that Depop is the winner here. Triple digit growth in the last quarter. It is low cost. These pieces are one of a kind. And I also think it's a really creative platform. Gen Z approach it like their social media, and they love shooting the product and really seeking out, treasure hunting these one of a kind, totally unique pieces. They're very proud of their finds. And
that goes back against the hygiene piece as well. You know, if Depop can be exploding like that secondhand, you know, I think that view on hygiene is more a sort of concern of you know, media and investors probably, as opposed to actually genuinely how the consumer is feeling.
Well, it's an antiquated view, and I think you're right on the investors, because I have to say the startups on the call did both say that it was a problem on the investment side, and that's where they get questioned in those meetings.
Yeah.
The consumer doesn't see a problem.
No, I don't think so. Maybe some do, but I think it's a minority. Most people would wash stuff when it arrives anyway.
Well, exactly. Come on, everybody. So that is undoubtedly good news. But then this same Generation Z, interestingly, are not taking to the rental model as much as millennials. In a UK survey
surprises me.
It really surprised me.
Yeah.
Well, I will tell you why. In a UK survey last year by Mintel, 46% of respondents in the age bracket of 16 to 24, so 46% said they weren't interested in renting at all. 34% they had never rented but would be open to it, and 20% said they had rented an item of clothing. So it's really not much compared to millennials. For them, I think it's lack of ownership. That was a key thing that they cited. They actually really like this idea of owning a piece and then reselling it, and they love that very pure circularity of ownership that they have forged. Plus, it's the prohibitive costs of rental, which obviously needs to be mentioned, whether it's a subscription model or a one-off or a more special piece. And then there's the authenticity. This was the generation that called out the juxtaposition of these high street major brands having their little rental capsule and then also producing massive collections at scale with very, very questionable sustainable credentials. So for them, it just wasn't authentic, this style of sustainability. So we come back to incentive. This is the generation most driven by sustainability. They are the activists, as we were saying earlier. Will they mature into rental as they start working, as their income grows, and as maybe they have more events to go to? Personally, I think most likely. And for now, if they approach their consumption with as much drive in and as circular a manner as the media would have us believe, I would say we are in very, very safe hands indeed. Finally, just very briefly, let's not forget influence. This is the generation who have recently called out influencers who work with Boohoo. And they did that just in the same way as I mentioned earlier, calling out the high street stores and their rental models. When it comes to influence, I also have a question for you, Rachel, which I'm going to end on. You wear many hats, but one of them, and by background originally, you are a journalist. Now, the buzz feature in Fashion Editorial last year was rental. There seemed to be a feature in every newspaper and every magazine on a weekly basis about how it all works. My question is, that was novel then, but how can that coverage continue when really these items are one-offs? Was it just a novelty last year? And does the press have that kind of influence to make the change? Perhaps it's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, media does keep coming up in each time we talk about these things around the role that it can play in all of these conversations, of which it's obviously huge, and we've seen that massively obviously recently with the various different press coming out around the labor side of fashion, what with Boohoo, and of course all of the exploitation happening in China. It's really hard. I mean, listen, it's a bit like fashion, right? When you're a journalist, especially on the consumer side of media, you need newness. You need constant newness to hit a story, that by virtue of the fact that it's called news, it needs to be new. So it's difficult, because at the end of the day, once that story's been told, how do you keep bringing it back again and make it fresh for consumer? I think the story previously was about the fact that rental existed. I think probably going forward, it will be around, what you can actually, when it's looking at shopping side of things, what you can actually now get on these rent platforms. The difficulty there, of course, is that's what's then encouraging the rental platforms to have more and more in the way of newness as well. And how do you then balance all of that together? What would be really nice to see is actually that some of these worlds start to intersect a little bit. I don't think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that we haven't seen one of the big resale partners one of the big resale players, teaming up with one of the rental guys. That could become incredibly interesting. Is there a way that actually you start renting things that are already secondhand? I mean, it is in peer-to-peer, obviously, with some of those players that are in there, but that's individuals. Could there be another tie-up in another way? As the challenge that I mentioned before, that actually you just stop, really pushing essentially a linear model package one. So that is a challenge, and I think the media does have an important part to play there as well. So yeah, lots and lots that needs to be explored, unpacked, and obviously hopefully work towards with all of it. But I love today the way you brought those eyes together. Just to recap them, I'm going to see if I can remember them. We've got influence, we've got incentivization, we've got implementation, that one being around this idea that we need to move beyond just doing pilots and experiments and actually implement it across the business more broadly. We've got infrastructure, and we've got investment. Are those the five?
Did you say integration? Integration?
I said implementation. Integration, yeah, wrong word, but yes, exactly.
Close. Almost there. End, I think, because I know we're on a bit of a countdown now, Rachel, on our hour limit. So we are, yes, indeed. We are. So I, in that case, just wanted to say thank you all so much for watching. Please stay tuned. Monday, watch out, big FashMash announcement coming your way. And huge thank you to our sponsor, Clavio. Rach, do you have any parting thoughts?
just to say thank you once more to everybody for watching, the amazing engagement, comments, questions. Yeah, hugely appreciated. And listen out for Monday. We've got such exciting news we can't wait to share with everybody.